right, hello again. It is me, Megan. And I'm just going to talk to you a bit really broadly about what we do in the open source working group and encourage you to participate and also make you aware of it in case you had questions about specific projects. This is typically where we're talking about it. So I can't start this talk without thanking my other two contributors who aren't here in person, but Aaron Drone from CodePlay and John Malakinis from Intel. They both support the open source working group alongside myself and definitely helped contribute to this presentation today. So thank you to both of them. So for those that might be new to this, honestly, we all are, because the UXL Foundation is still very new. We really have just celebrated a one-year anniversary not that many months ago. So, you know, obviously when we consider maturity of open source projects and foundations, you know, time is obviously part of that maturity model. So given the age of the foundation, you know, we're doing quite well in terms of setting things up in a neutral way. But there are now questions that we have, you know, as we look forward and mature. So how do we reduce friction and provide a more unified experience across projects, right? From a developer perspective, but also from things like security and CI infrastructure. How do we increase transparency in our releases, right? Moving from a single vendor release process can be a little tricky, and we want to make sure that's in the open and that people can start participating that aren't necessarily directly involved with that single vendor, right? How do we increase adoption and grow contributors? Part of that is how we have the project set up. How you know, easy is it to get started with the project? How easy is it to start contributing? Are there guides that help you with that, right? And then lastly, how do we scale the project from an infrastructure perspective and set us up for, you know, a wildly successful future? I'm also the advocacy chair for Yocto project, which is a 15-year-old project. When that project started, you know, it was very much of that humble mindset that, you know, this is just a little thing and it's not really going to take off. And here we are 15 years later in satellites and coffee machines and every cell phone. And, you know, really it's been a struggle to now take a look at the way that we are doing our infrastructure and release processes using more of a kernel style, right? Since that's really what we had to go off of. So right now with the UXL Foundation, we have a really unique opportunity to take advantage of our moderate success currently and look to the future on how we can set ourselves up for scalability as the project and number of users grows. So you might have heard me mention this, right? One API and really came from Intel, and it was, you know, put under this UXL Foundation umbrella underneath the Linux Foundation. As Rod mentioned, this is really a big move to create neutrality and also to allow companies and people and organizations and researchers from across the spectrum to be able to participate. So when you're migrating from a single vendor to an open source foundation, there's obviously a lot of considerations. I did not put them all here, just the few that I'm going to be talking with you about in this little lightning talk here. But infrastructure and testing, best practices, and security and project roles. These are all things that need to be reevaluated because they were probably done under a way that the single vendor operated and maybe not in a way that's the open source way or the way that your governance wants to run things. So first up is the CI infrastructure. So really, previously the testing and everything was done within Intel, which is really great and lovely. We really love that they made sure everything was working before it got pushed out. However, we really would love to see that become a more transparent and public process moving forward so that there's more opportunity from folks across the ecosystem to participate in the release process, right? So most of the infrastructure used by the UXL Foundation is hosted in private networks, and it does make it challenging for projects to accept contributions from the community since the changes usually need to be merged before running through CI and testing, right? So the goal is to establish infrastructure that can be triggered from the open source repos and show the results from any testing that's executed. So that's one of our initiatives is the CI and testing strategy. Part of that, though, also is money, right? That's not free to do at scale. So how do we look at the way that the foundation is structured to set us up to move forward in this very public, neutral way? And in part of that, it's also developing a default release strategy and doing that in the open as well. So trying to coordinate between all of the different projects on that. And, on the right, here are just some things that we've talked about in terms of the repos. They've all been moved over to GitHub. They're all on the UXL Foundation GitHub now, but there's different versioning styles and there's kind of some different naming conventions and things like that. So these are all things that we're going through now in this open source working group with the 6 project leads and kind of coming to a neutral ground on how to move forward in a way that will help organizations utilize multiple projects in one stack, which is very common. So security is another area that you'll be hearing about later today. So I'm just going to give you a real light touch over what's been going on here. But really we want a unified approach to security response across all of the projects, right? Anything under the foundation should have a unified security, response. So making sure that we have up-to-date security contacts for each individual project, that we have the correct way to communicate with the security response team for each project, and maybe even setting an SOP on how those are handled or escalated. And for those in the room, I'm sure there's a few of you familiar with the OpenSSF, the Open Source Security Foundation. They're running a community day across the hall over there. They put out something called the scorecard, which takes a look at your repos and kind of gives you a score based on what they've deemed as security best practices. So we went ahead and run that, and that's the image that you're seeing on the right-hand side here is the scores of the OpenSSF scorecard. Now, it doesn't automatically mean that a project that has a lower score is really that worse off. It's meant to be a guide or a checklist to say, all right, which things are relevant to this project and which things do we need to improve on and dig in on. So it's great that we have the data, and I know you'll hear more from Roman later on how we will actually, improve security moving forward. And then thirdly, but not lastly, is actually kind of developing some light touch role guidelines across all of the projects, particularly for maintainers and, merge access, right? We're living in the age of who are you, internet person? And we want to make sure that there is, established maintainer trust there. So even kind of looking at not dictating, this is the person you need to pick for being a maintainer, but setting, kind of some guardrails of like, this is the steps to progress from user to contributor to maintainer. And then, how do we establish that maintainer trust on an all up level before we grant that super mega access. And lastly, but not least, we do have a lot of best practices that we're rolling out. They are done in conjunction with the best practices working group in UXL Foundation that Rod looks after. And we really, again, want to create this very transparent approach. I used to work for AWS. We had some in-house open source projects that are quite large. However, they were really lacking in external contributors because they didn't have a public roadmap. So even though people liked the project, they weren't really sure what's the future direction of that project, what are the next major milestones, how can I jump in, where can I contribute, and that sort of thing, right? So all the individual projects have now created their own roadmaps, and then we're kind of tracking milestones on an all-up level as well. And that's particularly helpful, again, for organizations that are using multiple projects within their stack. So health metrics, of course, we want to look after all of our projects here, right? And we need the data to be able to do that. So kind of talking about, metrics without a real reason are kind of just numbers, right? And so we need to be able to look at the metrics and tell a story from them. This is not meant as a way to, evaluate projects from a, positive or negative perspective, but simply looking at them from a sustainability perspective and making sure that we're providing resources to the projects that need it. So that would be looking at things like number of organizations contributing to a project, or increase in contributors over time, or the amount of time a PR takes to from open to close, and just kind of evaluating those things. So that's something that we're really looking forward to doing in the future, and we are setting the groundwork for that now. One of the other things the projects are working on is creating these getting started guides. This kind of feeds back to that question of like, how do we lower the entry point for people and not only just becoming a user of the projects, but actually maybe eventually contributing to them. So the getting started guides for each of the projects should provide a unified experience for getting started across any of those projects, and should be available publicly, so people can just rip it whenever they want. And then lastly is the website. We've got a unique situation here with OneAPI, and the backstory and the UXL Foundation. And as we already had someone in the room mention before, oh, well, this took me to an Intel website to download, right? Those are all things that we're looking to try and clean up, migrate all completely over to the UXL Foundation website, and just make sure that that's your one-stop shop for all things, right? And same for the GitHub. All the projects are moved into the GitHub organization now, and working on making sure that the links don't just take you to an external web page to download binaries from. And then we're also trying to rebrand the website moving forward so that it's a little less confusing between, what's in OneAPI toolkit versus what are the individual projects and that sort of thing. So that's another big project for us this year and looking into 26 beyond. So that's all I have for you on this today. I think we've got 2 or 3 minutes if there are any questions that you have about the best practices working group or any of the information I shared with you today.